Hello friends, how's it going? It is Michael Parker and welcome back to another episode of Michael Parker Media. This week, Senator Marco Rubio of Florida stated publicly that high-ranking U.S. government officials have firsthand knowledge of a secret Pentagon crash retrieval program for UFOs or UAPs. This admission by the Vice Chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee corroborates what UAP whistleblower David Grusch told the world earlier this month in an interview with journalist Russ Coulthart. Now, even more extraordinary testimonies were offered just days after Grusch at Stephen Greer's National Press Club event on June 12th. Dr. Stephen Greer is, of course, the controversial founder of the Center for the Study of Extraterrestrial Intelligence, or CSETI. Our guest today knows him well. He is journalist Martin Keller, who worked with Greer for many years and is the man behind the book, The Space Pen Club. He has a lot to say. Martin, in the month of June, we've had a lot go on. We've had this UAP whistleblower. We had Stephen Greer's disclosure project, which I believe that you were in attendance for.
Correct. Yep. A couple of weeks ago in Washington.
And did you speak with Greer during that time?
Very briefly, he was extremely busy over the 3 days that the event. It was 2 days of seminar, and then the third day was a 3-hour press conference at the National Press Club. And we can talk more about that. But Greer and I have history. Obviously, I was his first PR guy when he was just getting the Center for the Study of Extraterrestrial Intelligence, aka CSETI, off the ground in the early 90s. And we had some pretty good adventures from like 92 through 97, including the first disclosure event in Washington at the Westin Hotel. I think we only had about 12 to 15 witnesses at that. And then, of course, in 2001, he had a really kind of peak disclosure event with I forget how many witnesses were on the dais. I did not attend that one. I tried to log on and could not get on, along with thousands of other people.
That's right.
He claims it was jammed electronically, which I have no way of knowing if that's true. But I also know when thousands of people are trying to descend on a website that they will crash the website pretty easily. So,
and I think that most people, if they've heard of any of these press club events that he's had, that was the one that they knew about, was the one in 2001.
Yeah, and that produced quite a bit of documentation, film-wise, written word. I think you can buy the whole witness package at some place on the website, Disclosure Project website these days. And then, of course, Greer's books, which have been talking about disclosure as far back as the 90s. So we parted ways, though, in the late 90s, mostly because I had to make more of a living. And
sure,
I was working pro bono for him, but I was also growing a small public relations consultancy, which I'm still engaged in, and raising a young family. So I didn't have a lot of time to go stargazing with Dr. Greer or try to make him famous in the media.
I understand that. Well, I thought of you immediately because David Grusch situation, the man that came out on June 6th, who's a high-ranking intelligence officer who has said on television in front of a lot of people that the U.S. government is in possession of not 1, 2, 3, or 4, but potentially 10 to 15. He called them non-human origin technical craft or vehicles. Well, you would think that that would be huge news. And then 2 days later, Dr. Greer has this press club. And the reason I thought of you at the time was like my wheels start turning is because I didn't see the Grusch thing coming, even though I've been following this for a long time. And then 2 days later, Greer has his whistleblowers up there. So I thought of you because at first I was thinking, were these coordinated events? And I think I mentioned that to you in an email, but explain to me, you said they weren't necessarily coordinated, but Greer did know this was going to happen.
Well, Stephen claims he mentored Grusch. Is that how you say his name?
Grusch, yeah.
Grusch, yeah. That he mentored him a year ago in preparation for coming out, if you will, as he has in that debrief article, which I should point out to listeners was written by Leslie Kane and Ralph Blumenthal, the two intrepid freelance reporters who broke the New York Times story about this Pentagon secret UFO study group back in the
2017 December.
Yeah, that was that was when it was published, but the Pentagon study was actually 2009 to 2010, somewhere in there. 20,
Right.
maybe a little earlier. It started with Lou Elizondo at the helm, etc. But I think Leslie and Ralph knew Greer's thing was coming, and they hastened to publish their story before Greer's thing would eat up any of their bandwidth. Mm-hmm. And I know Leslie has kind of a distaste for Steve Greer for whatever reasons. I have some own personal observations about that, but they had offered it to the Times, yes. And the Times would seem kind of indifferent toward it. Washington Post said they would run it, but they needed to fact check it more, and it didn't suit the writer's timeline. So the debrief jumped on it, and it's gone viral. It's gotten a hell of a lot of coverage worldwide. I don't know why it has not risen to the top of the news cycle in this country.
Well, that's one of the things I wanted to talk to you about, because it's interesting to me. And by the way, ladies and gentlemen, you can go to Martin's website, which is thespacepenclub.com, which is also, he has a book called The Space Pen Club, which we will get to in a minute. But yeah, you're right. I mean, you would think that this story, when a whistleblower, which seems to have unassailable credentials at this point, because a lot of people at first were trying to say, well, wait a minute, let's look into this guy and see if he is in fact who he says he is. And it does seem that all of his credentials check out. So you would think that this was a bigger story. And for about 24 hours, it did get out there. I was even seeing it in my local LA Daily News in the morning news. But it was the typical kind of roll the eyes, snicker, play the X-Files music in the background. Then Greer's press club event happens 2 days later, which got, as far as I could tell, even less attention. And then last week we had the whole submarine thing, which just took everything off the table. Otherwise, it's Biden, Trump, Ukraine, submarines, Russians all the time. Here we are. We stand on potentially the precipice of this major human story, and crickets.
Yeah, a couple of things. One, thanks for pointing out the book's website. There's a fairly active blog I have going there, and I have I think it's really good download on what happened in Washington 2 weeks ago. It's called The Disclosure Project Puts, quote, shadow government, end quote, and its corporate defense contractors on blast in Washington, June 10th to 12th.
It's a really good article, Martin.
Yeah, thank you. It took me about 3 days to write it.
I could see that.
A lot of information to process from that event. But the thing about the Grusch testimony is that most of that was secondhand information. He said he was privy to photos, to first account stories from colleagues in the intel agencies and maybe military, which I found kind of curious. And it's probably his Achilles heel in this bigger saga, because everyone wants the goddamn evidence.
Yep.
Put it up front. We don't care how many witnesses you have. Let's put it on the table.
Yeah.
And I think until that happens, no one's really going to give a damn about it in the media or in the wider general population. One last thing on that, the Greer conference in Washington recently. I mean, it was pretty sad in terms of media turnout, and I attribute that to Steve's reluctance to hire paid professionals like myself or any other number of PR people that are out there and interested in this subject, to pay them real money to do their jobs and turn out media for something like this. He has got a totally volunteer driven organization, and there's no paid staff, which to me after 30 years just blows my mind. I don't know how he does it. I mean, I've been on boards of nonprofit organizations like his in the arts world, and they have paid staff, they had admin, and they hire out subcontractors for heavy lifting like publicity for major events, and this was potentially a major event.
It does seem a little odd. You're going to spend 30 years doing your life's work, but you're not hiring professionals to handle the press side of it. I'm going to let that be where it is. And I'll address the elephant in the room as well. It's like, look, a lot of people don't like Stephen Greer. I get it. I'm a bit agnostic on all that because I'm just taking the information everywhere I can get it. And then I want to be able to process it in my mind over time. So whether it comes from Greer or from somewhere else, it all gets the same treatment from me. And in this recent press club, I was actually pretty freaked out by some of the things that I heard, Martin, because some people might hear Grusch's interview and that would freak them out. But you and I have been doing this a long time. Grusch's account, in some ways, really is just everything that we already thought was happening. So we talk about crash retrievals in respect to what Philip Corso described, and many of the things that we thought were probably happening, he seems to confirm that. Now, Greer's press meeting, there are some very, very disturbing stories that were told there, and these are from firsthand accounts. And one of the ones that just blew my mind, and I had seen it in the Daily Mail, you mentioned it in your article, a couple of days beforehand, a friend of mine sent this to me, and he's actually overseas. And it was the story of, forgive me, I forget the man's name, but basically he is in Indonesia or Sumatra or something. He's up on a mountaintop.
Michael Herrera.
Yes, this gentleman. And he sees a man-made UFO with some form of contraband, weapons, we don't know what it is, being loaded onto it by a paramilitary group.
Yeah, disturbing story. Before we dive into it, I think I should mention that besides Greer, there was another presentation on crash retrievals and body recoveries by Michael Schratt, who is an academic, a military historian specializing in military technology. This guy's got really a solid CV. And oddly enough, most of his crash and body retrieval information that he shared on, I believe it was Saturday, was derived from Dr. Leonard Stringfield's work going way back. Stringfield was also an academic, I think, at the University of Michigan or Wyoming, rather, and did a very extensive research on crash retrievals that were outlined in a series of 9 different sort of separate little books. And Michael's presentation in that arena relied almost 100% on Stringfield's work. And the only updates they had done to it was to illustrate some of these retrieval situations. And there's one in particular in Mexico that was really disturbing, and I didn't get into it on the blog, but it's basically there was a downed craft somewhere near the borders states between the US and Mexico, and the Mexican army descended on it, and the US swept in only to discover that most of the people on site had died from a biological agent, ostensibly attributable to this craft. Although to me, this, that part of the story smacks of a
Yes.
psyop. It's like, well, did did the ET craft and beings that were recovered from this actually kill these guys, or was it the U.S.
Right.
Special Ops team taking charge of it and putting out the human campfires around it? Really, really disturbing story, and probably the most jarring of the 19 or so case studies that Schratt looked at. But backing up to the Michael Herrera story, and I've read accounts like this previously where members of our military, Air Force, Navy, Coast Guard, even Army, have encountered members of another branch of service with no visible insignias on their uniforms, but definitely involved in some chain of command, definitely involved in some probably illegal or certainly black budget type operations with millions, if not trillions of dollars money involved. And here we really, here we cross over into National Enquirer land. But Herrera is a pretty stand-up guy, and his testimony was riveting. They were threatened. He and his men were on a humanitarian mission right after the big earthquake in Sumatra. And was it 2009 or 2007? Anyway, they were on a humanitarian operation, and they went into some dense jungle and came upon this clearing where they saw this pyramid-shaped craft hovering over like a landing area, and some trucks nearby with he thought they were probably weapons and maybe gold or something, but definitely something going on that you don't expect in a jungle, especially with a hovering craft that seemed to make no sound and have no propulsive system visible on it. And when they were threatened, they all thought they were going to die there because the guys threatened to kill them. They said, "What? You don't have any right being here. You shouldn't have seen this." They checked their military documents. They disarmed their weapons, and they let them go. They marched them out. They said, "Get out of here. Do not turn around, look back." Herrera, I think, said that he did catch kind of out of the side view as they were getting away from the site. He did see this craft take off at a really fast rate of speed and disappear without any sound. And then the next day, he was called into a debriefing office again with he said it was either an admiral or a general, but they had no insignia. They didn't have any bars or anything that would identify what branch of service they were with. Made to sign a non-disclosure agreement, an NDA, and told if he ever talked about it, he would be either executed or jailed. Well, that's pretty standard operating procedure from what I know from the black world, not to mention the corporate world. They tie you up in an NDA. It's really serious, though, if you breach these when you're involved in the kind of stuff that Michael Herrera was involved in. So Michael basically kept silence for 14 years until Biden signed into law the National Defense Department budget for for this year and part of next. And in that was a whistleblower clause, removing all penalties from guys in the service that were witnesses to this, men and women. So a lot of people, I think, are taking advantage of that. I just saw Senator Mark Rubio in the last 24 hours has affirmed that a lot of people have well, not a lot, but select individuals have come forward and testified to him and possibly to the Aero office.
Yes.
That they too have been witnesses to down crashes and recovered occupants.
Well, you read my mind, because that was one of the things that I wanted to cover, because in the meantime, from the June 6th Grusch testimony on camera, and then the Greer meeting 2 days later, there was a bit of a lull until on Monday when Rubio said this, and I believe he said it again to the same news operation that covered the Grusch interview, News Nation, which I had not heard of before any of this,
Yeah,
but
I think they're out of Australia, aren't they?
well, they may have something to do with Australia, but I think they have an office actually in Irvine, Texas, and because the reason I dealt into this because I was talking to somebody else about it on somebody else's show recently, and I was like, I wonder where these guys are from. Not that I want to be completely conspiratorial and think that you might manufacture a news organization out of thin air to create such a large story, which might be a psyop. I say that slightly in jest, but
Listen, man, anything is possible in
right,
this discussion.
right.
You know,
So
I've had a same conversation with a friend of mine, oddly enough, also in LA, who said that, you know, if you were really smart about this and wanted to totally control the narrative, you would have fake pro UFO gathering individuals and organizations to
well,
balance the negative ones.
yes, and Martin, I was, in my own personal journey of learning about this over the years, I would hear about the My Labs, the military abductions and man-made UFOs and things. And quite honestly, I used to kind of think, well, you know what? I almost find that more difficult to believe than the UFO UAP story itself. Now I don't know what to think. And Rubio, the statements that he made just a couple of days ago, he said a few interesting things. He was saying that yes, there are additional whistleblowers, and these people have firsthand accounts, and some of these are public people that I guess that we would know of. And he said that these people had been coming forward for 3 to 4 years prior. So this is not something that just started happening, and which makes me think, okay, well, wait a minute. So if these people have been coming forward for the last few years, I don't know what they've told you. You seem to be taking it seriously. And I think that Rubio and Gillibrand are taking these things seriously. But this is kind of the first I'm hearing about it when you kind of offhandedly say that this has been going on for a few years. But I'm still glad that it's happening, and I'm glad that Biden has signed that into law where there are whistleblower protections. But now we get to the other question, which I think was on a lot of people's minds. Is I have said this before, I would understand it if why people think this, that perhaps this whole thing must be some form of psyop. Why did you suddenly float this all of a sudden in the summer of 2023? I'm not saying that it is. I have long thought that the UAP, UFO, ET hypothesis is a real thing, deserves investigation. I've never thought that it wasn't possibly true, but this did catch me off guard, and it does make me wonder why now.
Yeah, those are all good questions. A forward point here to your point is that Representative Tim Burkhart from Tennessee and
Burkett.
Burkett
Yeah.
and Representative Luna, I think, who is also from Florida, along with Rubio, are calling for public hearings in the House in July. And I think they're going to want Grusch front and center and whoever else they can get. In my blog, I actually take a sidebar into somebody who was recently interviewed by the Aero office as well. A guy who was stationed at the Minot Air Force Base.
Yes.
I want to get his name right here. David Schindel, 1966 Minot, stationed at the Air Force Base in Minot. And there was a very, I think,
Demonstrable exhibition of force.
yeah, it's hard to describe it because everyone that was on the ground that saw it said it was almost indescribable. Basically, a very large unidentified flying object with rotating lights, colored lights going off and on, hovered over the base and quote unquote, the object took off alert all 10 of the nuclear tipped missiles, causing them to be unlaunchable at that base. Now, this account is revisited in the Space Pen Club book pretty extensively. A Minneapolis friend of mine, Tom Talene, did a huge dive on this. You can find it on the internet. He published his research in it. He's got interviews with other pilots who are not only affiliated with the base, but actually in the air when this incident occurred. They were coming back from their nightly run, strategic bomber runs or whatever they do up there. And they saw this object. They had it on radar, and the people on the ground were freaking out. It's a really well detailed research. And just Google Minot Air Force Base, Tom Talene, 1966. It's a great piece of research. It's highly respected in the broader community. And Schindel claims, and this is from the Minot Daily News, which oddly enough has done a really good job of covering this subject in the last couple of years, mostly because these airmen at this base have come forward to tell their stories after so many years. But Schindel says, he describes the incident, and then he says that he recently debriefed these folks
at Arrow,
and he, let me see what he says about that.
It wasn't good.
Yeah, they were. Schindel said the oral history reviews, quote unquote, were conducted with former military who have had sightings, incidents, and encounters impacting national security. Sad to say, however, Schindel says, I have now determined that Arrow is part of the cover-up and cannot be trusted. So, excuse me, but it's just.
Well, I share his skepticism, and I don't want to be pessimistic. I don't want to be skeptical, but I listened to part of that Arrow presentation with Kirkpatrick. What was it? Mid-May or whatever it was. I was like, I couldn't even listen to it. It was so dull. And it just felt like, wow, you're going to say, we're going to talk about the Chinese balloons. Are you kidding me?
Yeah.
No, let's cut straight to the matter here. So it does feel like, Schindel said, it does feel like, unfortunately, part of the cover-up. And in your piece, which you bring a really good point to this, because you compare this search for truth that we're now in as being similar to the civil rights movement of the 60s. And I share your opinion, because I don't know that we're ever going to have the truth from the government or from legacy media. It's going to come from independent journalists like you and I, and small town newspapers. And I think also it will be partially self-evident over time. I mean, I think we all know what happened to Kennedy and things like this, even though they never come clean on them. And I think that's part of their plan, is like, look, we don't ever want to fully admit this. We're going to leave you to your own devices, and that is going to be our version of disclosure.
Yeah, the overarching thrust of my blog, reporting on the Washington events of a couple of weeks ago, is that citizen groups are the only groups that have ever moved the needle on important matters like civil rights, the Vietnam War, name anything that, you had to just about take down the US government to get them to act. And I think that's an important thing that Greer has emphasized all along, and also Dan Sheehan, constitutional attorney who's been involved in things like the Pentagon Papers, the Karen Silkwood case, Iran-Contra. I watched Danny Sheehan work during Iran-Contra on television, and I fell in love with the guy. He's forthright. His credentials are solid. Jimmy Carter had him on staff to look into the UFO thing and write a briefing paper, which he did. Sheehan has also got close ties to the Vatican. He was trying to get information from them, was completely stonewalled. But Sheehan for years has been pounding that same drum. It's only citizen actions like Steve Greer and other organizations that are in the UFO UAP world that are going to get the truth to come out. But I did want to say one thing about Arrow, maybe in their defense, is that a lot of the stuff, a lot of these witnesses who are coming forth now are going into the classified version of Arrow and giving testimony like the testimony that we've been discussing about Mr. Schindel. But apparently they've had quite a few people come through there with very similar stories. So the public facing part of this new part of the bureaucracy, government bureaucracy, is very boring. It's all about housekeeping, and all the good stuff is behind the curtain. At least that's my read of it.
Yeah, I think that's correct. And at the end of the day, I want to be optimistic, and I think some of this is it's inevitable. I think that people are, or there is a portion of the population, because I had a phone call with a friend last night, a very close friend. We'd been out of touch for a few months because we're both busy, and I said, hey, by the way, because he's a UFO buff like us and deep into it. And I said, hey, man, have you been following this Grusch thing? And he says, yeah. He goes, what do you think? And I said, well, I think it's real. And he goes, and nobody cares. And I said, well, it does seem that way because it's not getting a great deal of, major media attention. But I think that there is actually a level of interest in this, that part of the reason they don't want to put it out too much in legacy media is they want people to think that there's not a level of interest in the subject.
Yeah, I think that's one reason. It's funny you should bring that up about nobody cares, because about 6 weeks ago, at the height of that one weekend where there were 3 mass shootings across the US of A, I wrote a very cynical, depressing blog about why we should give a rip about this subject when this is the kind of psychotic state that we've turned into.
Yes.
And threatened that this might be my last blog. Well, guess what? I went to Washington, got further into the rabbit hole. So ask me another question. Maybe I'll come back.
Well, you made a good segue a minute ago, because one of the things I wanted to ask you about, well, it's twofold. A, in all of my years of looking into this, I had never heard of this 1933 Italy crash that Grusch was talking about, and that brings us to the Vatican and Mussolini. And I basically what he said, because people would always, and I've heard this time and time again. I heard it just yesterday in an interview that Dr. Drew did with Lionel and somebody else. Oh, why do the UFOs only crash in the United States? And I've heard other people that I know say this. I'm like, they don't. It's not just, that's a stereotype from people that don't know anything about this. So, but that being said, I was not aware of this 1933 Italy crash that supposedly happened, and the Italian, I guess, military recovered this thing. Mussolini, then it was under his control. After World War II, the Vatican worked with the US supposedly and turned over the craft to us. Any thoughts on that?
Only one, and that Whitley Strieber did a pretty good download on that on his blog.
Ooh.
A week ago.
What did he say?
It sounds like it's probably real. It's at his unknowncountry.com website.
Mm-hmm.
Go to Whitley's blog, and he's got more detail on there about this alleged historical incident. I do remember what I was going to say in terms of nobody caring about the subject. A blog I wrote a few months ago, kind of out of frustration, and I didn't really delve into it. It was kind of the end of a longer blog about a related topic. And I just said, I don't think a real disclosure is going to happen until it comes from the visitors. The visitors are going to have to be involved. They're going to have to be on board with it. They're going to have to step forward and come out from behind their stealth cloaked presence and do what they need to do. And to me, that would be a true disclosure. I mean, Greer updated everybody in Washington a couple of weeks ago, saying that his database, which he has been accumulating since the 90s is now up to 750 witnesses.
Mm-hmm.
And I know for a fact that a lot of those people have been funneled in to Washington to debrief congressmen and senators, and now some of the people in Arrow in their it's called the skiff. I forget what it's a security room, basically
Yes.
security facility where these types of conversations take place without fear of being tapped or anything or leaked. Although I think we're going to see, I just have a feeling we're going to have more leaks on this in a big way.
I hope so. I'm like you. At the end of the day, disclosure, I think, would most effectively come from the visitors or the phenomena itself. And it makes me think of that weekend, those 2 weekends in DC. What was it, 1952 in July?
Yeah, that's
When,
coming up, that anniversary date, three nights,
yes. And I mean,
flyovers.
and that's something that has never been explained. Most people, if you mentioned it to them, I think they'd be like, what? I've never heard of this. But in some ways, you could say that the visitors might say, you know what? We flew over your place in 52 and you guys still somehow managed to ignore it. So,
Well, you know, that actually did get quite a bit of media coverage to the point where
for a minute, yeah.
the Air Force had to hold their second largest press conference since the end of World War II and kind of put this thing back into bed, tuck it in, and hope that it was going to go away again.
Mm-hmm.
And of course it did. Yeah, it's strange. I mean, I mean, how much evidence do you need,
Right.
really? Any rational person that does any serious reading on topic is going to go, yeah, of course this is real. Should we care about it? I don't know.
I remember in January of 2008, I'm from Texas, and I remember there was this unexplained craft that flew over Stephenville, Texas, which is a small hamlet not far from the Fort Worth, Dallas Metroplex. And this was a major event. It was January 8, 2008, I believe. And then we have all of this radar tracking. They scrambled jets. I think they scrambled like 9 or 12 jets to follow this thing.
Yeah.
And it was going down towards where Crawford,
Bush,
Texas, where Bush had his place. I mean, then we had the situation with the UFO over Chicago O'Hare. I mean, these things are in plain sight, people. It's right there.
I actually asked Michael Schratt about that Stephenville case, and he didn't know too much about it, but I said, I've always thought when we've got jets in the air trailing and or chasing these things, that maybe they're trailing them because it's one of ours and they're protecting it from being poached.
Right.
And he says, well, that's a viable observation. He says, but I don't have a lot of information on it. He did spend some considerable time on the Cache Landrum.
Yes.
Where the people, I forget where
that was outside of Houston or Galveston, but those people,
Texas too.
Yes, and those people had radiation burns, severe radiation
burns, and that one to me has always been open shut. That's one of ours that went sideways, and these people, unfortunately, wrong place, wrong time, and they tried to sue for recover monies for their health care, and it didn't work out too well. But yeah, it's Schratt made an interesting comment at the DC thing. He said that 90% of all these objects are man-made that are spotted, and that stands to reason.
Sure.
And then he went into some extensive explanations about how you can tell the difference between theirs and ours, what we call alien reproductive vehicles, ARVs, as they're known in the culture. He said most of them, including like the Hudson Valley sightings of the 80s, where these boomerang-shaped craft were seen extensively through a long period of time at night. He says those are probably all ours being being test run over what are pretty, benign, low population centers. And the triangles, the famous triangles that were been spotted all over the US and Belgium, those likely are ours too, although maybe not all of them. He said that the ones you can tell that are ours, you can see the hardware is very visible on it. There, you can see the seams, you can see the nuts and bolts, you can see the electronic wiring on them, especially on the boomerangs. He says the other craft that are not ours are generally kind of solid state, seamless, almost impenetrable. And we heard some stories in Washington about how recovered crashed alien vehicles were, you couldn't get into them with a laser or a hammer or anything. They're still pounding on some of these to see what's inside and how they tick.
You mentioned that Blumenthal and Keene were the ones who did the interview with Grusch, and then they kind of made a little, and listen, I've got mad respect for both of them, so this is not a dig, but several other people have pointed out this inconsistency, which is that Grusch says that not only do we have retrieved craft, and I think he kind of says that that's not even necessarily the right word to use, which is really interesting, but that we also have bodies. Now, Keene and Blumenthal did not introduce that into their article, and I think that she shudders to get into that. But on one part of me gets it. She probably thinks, well, wait a minute, but that's just a step too far. If we put that in there, then nobody's going to believe it. But Grusch says that we have the bodies of occupants. So whatever they are, wherever they're from, we have those bodies.
Yeah, he made those claims in the subsequent interview with News Nation.
Yes.
And, I met Leslie along several times many years ago, and I still have in my little archive of all this stuff her first big breakthrough story published in the Boston Globe way back in the Middle Ages. And, my hat's off to her. She works hard. She's a good researcher. She's a good writer, but she's very tactical and strategic about how, in her mind, she thinks this should be rolled out via the media to the public. Now, that's all fine and good, but when you got guys like Greer coming along going, hey, sister, this train left the station about 1955, and it's not slowing down for anybody. You can, try to put up as many stops as you want, but we've already got all the evidence we need. We just need to, I don't know, we need to make it happen. We need to get the visitors involved.
I'd like to say thank you to Martin Keller for his appearance on the show today, and you can learn more about his work and his writing at thespacepenclub.com. He's also on Facebook at the Spacepen Club, Close Encounters of the Fifth Kind, UFO Disclosure, and more page. You guys, I want to thank you all for listening. And if you could, please consider subscribing to the podcast. Give us a rating, give us a review, give us a thumbs up, whatever you do helps a lot. I appreciate it immensely. And I'll be back in a few more days with another show. Until next time, keep your heart and your mind open. Peace.